Chapter 5 of The Story of a New Zealand River by Jane Mander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Alice started back from the kitchen fireplace. The dusk was closing a late autumn day. When the sounds outside became more clearly defined, she turned towards the door with a breath of relief. She knew the footsteps very well. "You sent for me, Mrs. Roland?" Bruce's form filled up the small doorway. "Yes." Alice stood back in the shadow. It was apparent that in a month or two she would have another child, and, as the attitude of mind that had been imposed upon her demanded that women be ashamed of motherhood or of its signs before the event, and blissfully idiotic about it afterwards, she blushed whenever a man came near enough to see her. Bruce, who had seen previous blushes, guessed that she was blushing now. "There were 2 men here this afternoon looking for my husband," she went on. "I didn't tell them how long he would be away. Did you see them?" Bruce felt that she was frightened. He knew something unusual had driven her to send for him. It was the first time she had ever done so. "Yes, I did," he replied. "They went off some time ago. That's all right." Just then his eye rested on a heavy iron camp oven set on the hearth. When he had seen it that morning it had stood in the woodshed. "Mrs. Roland," he said sharply, "are you lifting that oven about?" Alice was so amazed at his tone that she answered meekly, "Yes." Bruce took a step into the kitchen, anger in his eyes. "Mrs. Roland, do I have to tell you that you are committing a crime against yourself, a most unnecessary crime? I came here this morning to know what I could do for you, and you could have asked me to bring it in." She felt condemned. "I'm used to lifting it," she said weakly, in justification of herself and without thinking what her words implied. "Used to lifting it," repeated Bruce. "I mean when my husband is away," with a return to dignity, but that was a lie, and she knew that he knew it. "Then in the future, Mrs. Roland, when your husband is away, you will please let me know when you want it moved. You will not lift that oven again. Your doing so is an insult to any decent man on this place. Do you want it put out now?" "Yes, please," she said helplessly. She stood as void of volition as a straining post as he swung to the fireplace and grasped the oven by its semicircular handle. "The woodshed?" he asked. "Yes, please." Hot and cold by turns she watched him swing it out. Then he came back to the door. "Is there anything else I can do for you, Mrs. Roland?" "No, I'm sure, thank you." "Have you enough cut wood?" "Yes, plenty for a day or 2." He turned. "Oh, do you know where Asia is?" she asked. "I haven't seen her since she brought me your message, but I'll hunt her up." "Thank you," she answered. Bruce got as far as the kitchen window when he turned and retraced his steps. But he was no longer the doctor. He had become the foreman again. "Mrs. Roland, if that money is worrying you, perhaps you would like me to take charge of it till Bob Jones comes for it. He mayn't be here for a week, and it's a big responsibility. It would be quite safe with me." "Oh, I don't think that is necessary," she said nervously, but striving to be calm. "It ought to be quite safe with me, and besides, my husband left it in my charge." He saw it was hopeless. She was too proud to show how frightened she really was. Knowing the likely effect upon her of fear and responsibility, he was angry at her stupidity. There was nothing to do, however, but to accept her decision. He turned away again, leaving her more wrought up than ever. He guessed that she imagined that every man about the place knew of the plant of money at the boss's cottage, awaiting the arrival of the bush contractor. He knew she would think that the desperate-looking tramps who had applied for work that day had come to take stock of the house with a view to robbery. He was sure her nights were one long agony of fear, but against her impenetrable barrier of reserve he was as impotent as a jellyfish. It made him furious. Bruce had gone warily with her in the past 8 months. He had never forced a moment with her, but had given her chances, not too obvious, which she never took. He knew that she avoided him, and he could not understand why. She had become courteous. She had managed to smooth down the bold uneasiness of her beginning into a routine of indifferent pleasantness. But she never sat in the front room while he and Roland worked if she could possibly avoid it. In the last 2 months, since the completion of the store and the arrival of Bob Hargraves, who was to be bookkeeper and storeman, they had done most of their night work in the store, and Bruce had been only rarely to the boss's house. He knew Alice had employed Sonny Shoreman to milk the cow, to cut wood, and to run what errands there were. But Sonny had now gone to work in the bush, and so, since Roland's departure 3 days before, Bruce had called morning and evening, as a matter of course, to ask Alice what he could do. He found that the boss had arranged with Bob Hargraves, who was a cheerful and obliging soul, to milk the cow. Of his own accord Bob had also seen to the wood, so that it did not leave Bruce much of an excuse to call. He was the more surprised, therefore, when Alice had sent for him. And, as he walked away from her, he wondered exactly what she had wanted of him. He felt it was more than the assurance that the Tramps had gone. At times he felt badly about her attitude towards him. She attracted him, and he could see no reason why he should appear disagreeable to her. He could not believe that pride alone was responsible for her continued aloofness. He did not ask that she should treat him as an intimate friend. He knew that sort of thing was not to be had for the asking. He felt that he had a right to demand that she should get off the defensive with him, that she at least should treat him as if he were the decent man he knew himself to be, and this last he was determined to make her do. He thought savagely now as he strode on down the slope towards the sandspit of his one lapse in that 8 months, when he had ridden away to Hakaru, the place that boasted the best public house for miles around, where he had whiskied himself dead to the world for a week. For 2 weeks after his return he had not gone to the boss's house, and when he did, and had first met Alice's eye, he had felt with terrible sensitiveness that he saw in it, veiled with Christian pity, a deep condemnation and disgust. It made him hot to think of it. He paused on the path. Just below him, set in the low rushes on the bank, loomed the framework of the new blacksmith's shop, with a corner of the store projecting beyond. Down from the head of the bay, across the mudflat, over the spit in front of the store, ran the elevation for the tramway to deep water, still in process of construction. A shapeless black cloud curled over the northern range, bringing premature darkness upon the river. An erratic wind, now wheezy, now snorting, rustled and clicked through the cutty grass bushes. Bruce stood a while, enjoying the sadness in the moaning of the wind and the gloom in the shades about him. He was mostly too busy to enjoy such luxuries as reactions to the atmosphere, but when he did take time to respond to the voice of nature he got something that he remembered. He heard footsteps crunching on the shells. Asia came running round the end of the cliffs, a chain or so away. She panted towards him. When she reached him he saw by her eyes that she too had been caught by something in the night. "What do you think?" she began mysteriously. "There are 2 men round in the old boat shed. They came to the house this afternoon and frightened Mother. Now they're there. I saw them. I played Red Indian and followed them. They shouldn't be there, should they?" Her eyes were alight with the spirit of adventure. "They should not, but I'll settle them. Now don't tell your mother about it, will you? Let her think they went away this afternoon." He put his hands on her shoulders. She looked up puzzled. "That's lies," she said. "You needn't tell any lies," he smiled. "Don't say anything at all." She still looked puzzled. "Why is Mother so frightened?" she asked. "Is she frightened?" "Yes, she's often frightened, and yet she says God takes care of us. And she's been worse lately, and it makes me afraid too." She looked up at him with a worried expression in her eyes. "Oh, don't you worry about it," he said reassuringly. "Your mother is not very well. That is why she is nervous, but she will be better soon. Do you believe we are quite safe? Do you know God takes care of us?" she asked abruptly. "Yes, I know you are quite safe," he answered firmly. "Then why have you been up the last 3 nights, sitting in our woodshed?" Startled, he looked down into her face. "You saw me?" he demanded. "Yes." "Did your mother see me?" "I don't know, but I didn't tell her because I thought you did not want us to know." "Thank God for that," he exclaimed, forgetting he was talking to a child. "Do not tell her that either, will you?" "What were you doing? Were you taking care of us?" she asked. "Yes," he said frankly. "Then God doesn't take care of us?" she cried, startled. Bruce hesitated. "We have to take care of ourselves as well," he began, "and not do foolish things. Now listen while I explain to you. Your father left a lot of money in your house when he went away. That was foolish, because somebody might try to steal it. Your mother knows that, and so she is frightened, and that is why I came to take care of you." But she was not satisfied. "Then why didn't you come in and stay with us?" she demanded. Bruce groaned inwardly. "But your mother would not like us to know she is afraid," he replied. "That is silly." She stamped her foot. "When I tell her you sat out in the cold she won't mind. I am sure she won't." "You must not tell her," said Bruce firmly. "Now please remember. There is a reason why I do not want her to know, and I am right outside, and I will take care of you. Don't be afraid any more. Nothing can hurt you or come near you. Now, to please me, you just keep it all a secret." Her eyes glowed with importance. She felt it was wonderful to have a real secret with him. She seized his hands. "Oh, Mr. Bruce, you are lovely," she cried. "I just love you lots." He laughed, ignoring her fervour. "Go home, Red Indian," he said, "and think it is all a story, and don't be afraid." She ran joyously up the hill. Bruce stood for a moment watching her. Then he walked on towards the kitchen. The big zinc building near the head of the bay was now the scene of its second daily scrimmage. Some 40 men in all stages of crude cleaning up stood about outside, washing at basins set on boxes, rubbing down soapy faces, or diving into boxes underneath their bunks for garments that seemed no cleaner than the ones they were discarding. There were old men and young men, men of finished and unassuming blackguardism, and crude youngsters swaggering with first knowledge. There were men who had decency still healthy, but not obtruded upon an unsympathetic world, men who remembered their mothers. There were men who did not know what decency was, and who, to use the current phrase, would have robbed their mothers' coffins. There were strange social inequalities in that gang. English university men bunked next to the colonial-born sons of pioneer traders. The men who still got literary reviews and scented letters read side by side with those who revelled in Deadwood Dicks and got no letter at all. Individual eccentricities were lightly taken and sometimes curiously respected, provided they were not paraded as a virtue. The one thing the motley group would not stand, individually or collectively, the one thing its members could detect instantly, was side, and any man who arrived with affectations soon had them as effectually knocked out of him as he would in a big public school. The nomad of the bushes is a grim realist. He has no use for trimmings, but he does cherish a secret admiration for those men who, being superior, do not parade the fact. Every man in that crowd liked the boss. He worked with them, he ate with them, he swore with them. He was extraordinarily fair with them. He had a way all his own of being familiar and yet, at the same time, commanding their respect. And every man liked David Bruce for quite different reasons. They would have found it much harder to say why. The fact that he was a doctor had a good deal to do with a never-mentioned sentimental regard that entered into the feeling of many of them. But they would have liked him whatever he had been. His fine physique and athletic training were assets to be reckoned with. But it was his simplicity and straightness in all his dealings with them that commanded their attention most. As he strode into the kitchen now, men near his bunk made way for him. "Going to shoot somebody?" asked Shiny, catching the expression on his face. "Probably," replied Bruce calmly, hauling, to their surprise, a revolver out of the box beneath his bunk. "I want a volunteer," he added. "Me," snapped Shiny. "Come on, then. Bring your rifle." Bruce turned to the cook, who was putting what he called the finishing touches to the long, bare table, laden with tin basins of potatoes and cabbage and dishes of tinned meat. The steam rising off them dimmed the glasses of the kerosene lamps hanging from the beams above. "I'm after those tramps, Jim. They've been hanging round here all day. Did they come here?" "No," replied the cook. "All right. We'll give them a meal. Then they'll have to get out. We'll be back in about half an hour." Bruce lit a lantern and was followed out by Shiny, who was as jolly as a boy at the prospect of a diversion. When they heard the cautious steps upon the sand, the two tramps drew back into a corner of the boat shed. But the light of the lantern, turned suddenly upon them, revealed them clearly to their captors, and showed them Shiny's rifle pointed inconveniently straight in their direction. "Hands up!" he roared. As they knew they had no hope in a fight, they obeyed. "Come here," commanded Bruce. "I ordered you off hours ago. I told you you could go to the kitchen and get some food, and I told you you hadn't a chance of getting work with us. You couldn't last a day at our job, and the trouble with you is that you don't look as if you wanted work. I don't wonder the farms turned you down. Now, before we do anything for you, we'll see what you've got. Go through them, Shiny." Bruce covered them with his revolver while Shiny turned out their pockets and overhauled them carefully. A few pence and a couple of knives was all he found. The wretched wasters, sick, hungry, and desperate, made no attempt at protest. They had honestly tried to get work, but for weeks every man's hand had been against them. They had heard 2 men say the night before at the Hakuru public house that Tom Roland was a fool to leave money where it could so easily be got at, and they had been drawn as by a magnet to the bay that day to see if there was any chance for them. Under the guise of asking for work, they had taken stock of distances, and their short interview with Alice had shown them that she might easily be frightened into silence. They had not had anything so desperate as murder in their minds. All they wanted was money. Grunted Bruce, as he saw all that they possessed. "That looks pretty hopeless. Come on, we'll feed you first." Bruce could not show how badly he felt about the wretchedness of life for such as they, but he showed more sympathy than they expected as he asked them where they had tried to get work. Back at the kitchen the tramps were seated at the end of the table, where they ate silently, their heads down, and refused to be drawn into conversation. When they did not answer the more friendly questions, the crowd began to bait them mercilessly, to ask them about their love affairs and what hotels they preferred, and the brands of wine they would recommend. David Bruce listened for some time in silence. Then he stood up. "Here, shut up, you fellows," he said good-humouredly, "and pay for your fun. These poor devils haven't a bob between them. Now, you wouldn't find starvation interesting, even as a new experience. Come on, you've all got something you'll waste in the course of the next week or two." He put a half-sovereign on the table. After every man had found something he could spare, Bruce handed nearly £6 over to the tramps, who became obsequiously and pitifully grateful. "Now, I'll see you down the road to Point Curtis," said Bruce. He lit the lantern, and they followed him out to the accompaniment of a bombardment of coarse suggestions as to how not to waste the windfall. As they went round the head of the bay, Bruce told them they could get a gum outfit at the Point Curtis pub 3.5 miles down the river, and that they would be shown the way to the gum field where they could easily make a living digging gum. When they had gone 1/2 mile down the Great North Road, he stopped. The moon was just coming over the top of Pukekaroro behind them. "Now listen to me," began Bruce, peering into their faces. "Don't you come back here. We have done all we'll do for you for the present, and if you make yourself a nuisance, look out. British law hasn't arrived here yet, and some of us aren't particular how we do up corpses for the Almighty. But if you go on that gum field and keep straight and get some strength up, you can apply for a job later on. Go on. No thanks necessary." He stood looking after them till the sound of their footsteps died away on the road. He knew they were pretty hopeless, but he had to give them the chance. He heard 2 weeks later that one of them was drowned while drunk in the river by Point Curtis. He never heard of the other again. Returning to the kitchen, he sat down outside and smoked till someone came out and asked him to play. Bruce always enjoyed the incongruity of music in that kitchen, walled with its rows of narrow bunks, with its bright nickel lamps hung from the central beams, its colossal fires in the open zinc chimney, and the limp figures of the men smoking or reading on their beds or playing poker at the corners of the table. Later on, Bruce and many other men built shanties and houses for themselves, but at present the whole force of workers about the bay was crammed into that one building, with as little room as the sailors have in the forecastle of a battleship. Bruce didn't play down to his audience unless they asked him to. Sometimes the crowd would hum to an air they knew, but mostly they listened in silence. When he was in the mood, as he was this night, some men would drop books and with their hands over their eyes be carried back to something they had valued. Bruce's music was the one thing they were not ashamed to show feeling about. When he had played for an hour, he put away his violin and went out, not to meditate on his past, as some of them supposed, but to play watchdog to the boss's wife. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Story of a New Zealand River by Jane Mander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Asia, it's time you went to bed. Alice did not say it convincingly, for she dreaded being alone. Yes, mother, said the child, understanding that it was not an order, and making no attempt to move. She sat in a tangled attitude on the narrow sofa, her head bent over a dilapidated Boy's Own Annual that Roland had bought for her at an auction sale in Auckland, her brains on fire with the adventures of a party of explorers in the Silver Canyon. The glow of the open fire, rivaling that of the kerosene lamp, played on the bare walls of the front room. It had been lined, but was still unpapered. A plain oblong table, with a flowered cover, stood in the centre. The floor was now covered with a new linoleum of much too large a pattern, Roland's choice, but there were no rugs. On the narrow mantelpiece was a row of Alice's bodes: Tennyson, Browning, Charlotte Bronte, Cowper's poems, Drummond's Ascent of Man, Butler's Anthology, Paley's Evidences, Pilgrim's Progress, and some children's books, line upon line, Peep a Day, and more modern ones issued by the Religious Tract Society. There were no knickknacks anywhere, and no pictures. Alice's piano, which seemed to fill up half the room, suggested magic rather than plain fact. Alice sat with a heap of mending beside her, but she was so restless that she could hardly sew. She had been getting more and more wrought up each day since her husband had left for Auckland. On his previous absences she had been nervous enough, but she thought that, as time went on, she would get used to it. Now the responsibility of the money imposed upon her nervous condition was driving her fast towards hysteria. The appearance of the Tramps that day was the last straw. After they had gone she worked herself into a fever, fighting her desire to send for Bruce. The mere sight of him, she felt, would steady her nerves, and she wanted to be sure that he was about. But she did not want him to know that she was frightened. She did not want him to offer to do anything. She only wanted to be sure that he was there, within reach. For over an hour she had kept going to the window to look for him, but not once had she caught a glimpse of him. Finally, unable to resist the impulse, she had sent Asia after him, and had then dreaded his appearance, not knowing what she could say. His words about the Tramps had somewhat reassured her, but his words about the camp oven had charged her with another kind of excitement. It seemed to her to be such an intimate incident. He had assumed the right to take her in hand, and she knew she had been helpless to resist him. After he had gone she sat down, sick and trembling. Her nervousness increased. She thought of sending to ask Mrs. Brayton to come down to stay with her, but she felt this would be an appalling confession of cowardice. She knew she would have to be alone again and again, and she told herself she had to get used to it. But as the evening wore on she wondered how she could possibly get through another sleepless night. She jumped up suddenly, walked to the front door, opened it, and looked down upon the starlit river and up at Pukekaroro looming dark against the moon. Then she heard the sound of Bruce's violin. She stood there listening till the music stopped. Then she found that she was very cold. She shut the door and put more wood on the fire. She tried the experiment of repeating hymns and religious poetry, but she was terrified to find that the thought of God failed to help her. It grew late, but she said nothing more about Asia's going to bed. When it was nearly 11, however, the child got up of her own accord, kissed her mother good night, lit her candle, and went out through the kitchen to her little room, which opened off it. The one window opened towards the back with a view of the bare hill. Asia did not undress. Instead, she put on an old astrakhan jacket and knelt down to pray that her mother would cease to be afraid. Then she took a dark blanket off her bed, wrapped it round her legs, and sat down by her open window, gently pushing it open further till the lower sash was up as far as it would go. She meant to watch for David Bruce. Since she had begun to read the Boy's Own, her mind had been a ferment of adventure and romance. Men were wonderful beings, she thought. She was full of exaggerated notions of their strength, their beauty, their tenderness, their care for women. Precocious beyond her mother's imagining, she knew also that there was something else, something mysterious that made them creatures to be looked up to, feared, and obeyed. She had known the first night that she had seen David Bruce in the backyard that he was there to do something for them, and she instinctively felt that he was in some way taking the place of Roland. She knew he must be cold and uncomfortable, and she immediately made of him a hero. With his big body and his kind eyes and his gentle ways and his unafraidness, he seemed to her the very incarnation of all the heroisms of her favourite heroes in the Boy's Own. And because he was a hero, she had to be the heroine. And she would rescue him from the cold. This night she meant to make him come into her bed while she indulged in a riot of sacrifice by sleeping on the mat. So she sat watching for him. Bruce crept cautiously by way of the cliffs to the paling fence at the back of the yard and sat down on a low stump. From the store he had seen the light still burning in the front room, and he was afraid lest Alice should look out. He was not at all easy in his own mind about the money. There was more than one man in the boss's employ to whom £400 would be a formidable magnet. It would be easy for any one of them to get away to one of the great northern gum fields, lie low for a time, and then ship by way of a timber vessel to Australia. So Bruce had let the impression gain ground among the men that he was staying at night in the boss's house on guard. They all knew he was armed. This night Bruce was very weary, and he wondered how he was going to keep awake. He sat on till he was sure Alice must have gone to bed. Then he made his way slowly round the fence to the side gate and got safely into the yard without having made a sound. He started as he caught sight of Asia at the window and shook his fist at her. He could see her mouth opening and shutting silently, and her fingers beckoning, but he waved her back. Just then, as she sat in a frenzy of fear over the dying coals in the front room, Alice felt there was somebody about. With a courage born of sheer desperation, and to save herself from screaming, she jumped up, moved to the front window, and pushed aside the blind. But there was nothing to be seen in the moonlight but the things that were there by day. Then she walked quietly out into the kitchen. Asia, hearing her, gasped and gesticulated wildly at Bruce, who did not see her as he turned to pick up his rug. Alice went straight to the kitchen window and pulled aside the blind. She saw the figure of a man crouching in the yard. She gave one frenzied shriek and fell in a heap on the floor. Sick and trembling, Asia rushed to unlock the back door. Bruce almost fell over her. "Light a candle," he cried as he dashed into the kitchen. By the light of it he gathered up Alice's contorted body, carried her into her room, and laid her on her bed. "Get me a pencil and paper." Asia ran to get her own candle, found her pencil and a piece of paper bag, and hit her big toe badly as she ran back to him. He almost snatched the things from her and dashed off a note. "Take that to the kitchen, give it to Bob Hargraves, and tell him not to lose a minute. And, child," he was now aware of her scared face, "don't be afraid, be brave. I shall want you badly tonight. Come back as fast as you can." He gripped her shoulders with hands unaware of their strength, and poured more into her than he dreamed. Primed with those words and that grip, she flew to the kitchen, hammered on the door, and gasped her message to the first man who spoke. Bob was one of the few men in camp who owned pajamas, which he had stuck to in spite of much chaffing. He did not wait to change after reading Bruce's note, but snatched up a case of instruments from Bruce's chest, and yelling, "Get a horse, somebody," he bounded out of the door and got to the boss's house with Asia chains behind him. Back at the kitchen he slipped on his lightest boots and rode off as he was, bareheaded, for the only maternity nurse Kaiwaka possessed. When Asia got back she found that Bruce had already made up the front room fire. Directly he heard her come to the bedroom door he said, "I must get the children into your room." As he carried them out they woke and fretted, but she soothed them to sleep again. She had only just got them quiet when she heard Bruce calling her. With a fierce excitement burning her from head to foot, she hurried to and fro, getting the things he had ordered. Action kept her thoughts busy. She did not feel the fingers she scalded or the toe bleeding inside her woolen slipper. She felt that she was important, and that she had a fine opportunity to show Bruce how useful she could be. It was not until she sat down with everything ready that she began to wonder what it was all about. She could not bear the inaction. She felt that something strange and terrifying was going on in that closed room, and she wanted to go in and help. She knew she would not be so frightened if she could see. She went desperately to her mother's door. "Mr. Bruce, the water is all ready," she cried desperately. "All right, don't come in. Go back to the kitchen," he called curtly. Before she had been back there long, Bruce was calling for hot and cold water. Action helped her again. She hurried with 2 jugs to the bedroom door. He took them without looking at her, and quickly closed the door, shutting her out from that horrible unknown. She wanted to scream, to beat her hands upon the door, and beg to be let in. She felt that whatever it was, if she could only stand beside Bruce, she would feel better. Then she remembered that he had told her to be brave. She went back to the kitchen and made up the fire there to keep herself warm. In spite of her efforts, tears poured down her cheeks, but she was careful not to be heard. As she shook and sobbed, the bedroom door opened and Bruce called her again. "Bring me a little hot milk. Don't boil it." That helped her. Hot milk was such a plain everyday fact. She prepared it carefully and called from the front room when it was ready. This time he saw her face. "Oh, child." Again he gripped her shoulder. "Don't be frightened. She is going to get better now. Be brave." Tears of relief rushed to her eyes, but he had no more time to spare for her. Once again he turned and shut the door. Asia walked back to the kitchen fire, sufficiently relieved to begin to be conscious of her burn and her bruised toe. She looked at the blister on her hand and wondered if she had better put some vinegar on it. But she was now almost too tired to bother. She sank down on the sack in front of the fire, and believing that her mother was really better, she fell asleep. She was partly roused by the sound of a horse's hoofs galloping up the slope to the cottage. As in a dream, she heard Bruce walk through the kitchen to meet Mrs. King at the back door. "Hope I'm in time. I was away with Eliza at that Crawdads," puffed the steaming countrywoman. "It's over," said Bruce. "Child born dead. She's very low. She will have to have very careful nursing. I gave a little chloroform. I'll send for Mount. There may be complications." Their voices died away in the front room. At last Bruce came into the kitchen. Asia rose stiffly from the floor, half dazed, and rubbing her eyes. "Poor child," he said, holding her tight against him. She sat up in his arms, feeling better and safe now that he was there. "Why, look at your hand," he said. "Oh, I scalded it," she said in a tired voice, "and my toe hurts too." "Dear me, we must doctor you now," he said lightly. He was distressed to see how exhausted she looked. So he made a great fuss over her burn and her badly bruised toe, and bandaged them both carefully with rags, and was glad to see that he had successfully taken some of the shock out of her. Then they heated some hot milk and drank it together, and then he ordered her to bed. "Will you come and tuck me in?" For the first time since the accident she resembled her old self. "I will," he smiled. He went into her little room when she called to say she was ready. Her red and swollen eyes glowed at him from the pillow. The baby slept peacefully on their mattress on the floor. As he tucked her in, Asia flung her arms round his neck. "I think you're just beautiful," she choked, looking into his tired, lined face. He understood. "Now, don't think I'm a hero out of a storybook. I'm just a mere mortal, and you've been a fine, brave girl. Now go to sleep, because there will be a lot for you to do tomorrow. Good night." He kissed her on the forehead. He was relieved to see 5 minutes afterwards that she was already asleep. Feeling pretty much of a wreck, he went to consult with Mrs. King. When he saw that the patient was resting safely, he threw himself down on the inadequate sofa in the front room to get a little rest before daybreak. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Story of a New Zealand River by Jane Mander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. For a week Alice hovered between life and death, knowing nothing. In that time there was a hush upon the bay. Bruce had stopped punt building on the beach and hammering and clanging in the blacksmith's shop and on the tramway. The men were careful not to call or shout within hearing of the house on the cliffs. Alice learned by degrees afterwards how everybody had rallied round her, and how well she had been cared for. Mrs. Brayton had sent Eliza King for Betty and Mabel, prepared to keep them all with her indefinitely. Dorrie Harding came at once with the messenger Bruce had sent by the river, and she and Mrs. Brayton together made broths and jellies equal to anything a city hospital could have produced. It was well in the second week before Alice dimly realized that Bruce was one of the people who moved about her in that misty world of fact that encompassed her bed. She was not surprised to see him, or annoyed to see him, or glad to see him. She accepted him, as she did the others, as part of that reality that her mind struggled at intervals to catch, but always failed to grasp with any degree of clearness. She was a body only. She felt merely pillows moved about her, warmth put to her feet, aches and pains soothed, wetness and dryness upon her skin, an interminable succession of teaspoons put into her mouth. At the end of 2 weeks she had her first lucid moment. She clearly saw Dorrie Harding in the chair beside her bed. "You here?" she whispered faintly. Dorrie leaned forward, smiling. "You mustn't talk," she said softly. "Have I been ill?" Alice disobeyed. "Yes, but you are getting better. Now be good." Alice's eyes closed and her mind grew foggy again. An hour later she recognized Mrs. King as somebody she had never seen before, but she was too weak to speculate about her. As her moments of consciousness increased she began to watch them moving about the room. In a day or two she seemed to be looking for something. Her eyes often wandered to the door. Her head turned at sounds. She missed something, but she did not know what it was she missed. "Asia," said Bruce when they told him. "Let her go in and hold her hand. But she mustn't talk." But Alice continued to look for something. One night she remembered what it was. She had not seen Bruce for days. He had been in her room, but only when she was asleep. She could not yet remember what lay behind her illness, what the cause of it was, or about the baby, or anything of her former relation to Bruce. She only knew that she wanted him, that it was as uncomfortable not to have him as it was to be cold or faint. "Hasn't somebody else been here?" she asked Mrs. Harding the next morning. "When?" asked Dorrie. "Last week when I was very ill. I thought there was someone." "Oh, no, dear, just Mrs. King and I. We are taking care of you." Dorrie lied according to agreement. In the first week she and Mrs. Brayton and David Bruce had held a cabinet meeting on the situation, all deciding that it would be best for the present that Alice should not know the details of her accident, or that Bruce had been alone with her when the baby was born. They all felt that would be rather too large a dose of life for her to swallow without some preparation. They agreed to let her think for as long as possible that Mrs. King had been at once available, and that Dr. Mount had come when he was sent for. Mrs. King, Asia, and Roland, when he returned, were all duly drilled in the story to be told. But Alice crept back to convalescence haunted by the memory in the shadows. And as her questions were answered, and as she began to remember, she felt more and more hurt that David Bruce, a doctor, had never been near her. Though she would have been startled had he actually appeared, the thought that he did not come began to obsess her. Once or twice she felt a little suspicious about those 2 blank weeks, and wondered if they were telling her the truth. Asia had been allowed to look in at her mother early in the illness. Bruce saw that it would help her to see that she was really there, still looking like herself, except that she was very white. The illness had intensified her feeling for her mother. She was consumed with a passion of sacrifice for her because she had suffered. She formed resolutions of patience and usefulness that would have amazed her elders. But as she stood beside the bed looking at Alice, Asia felt fearfully that in some way the accident had taken her mother away from her and set her apart. It was her first conception of the infinite loneliness of human beings. But she had exultations as well as sorrows. She learned what a wonderful thing it was to have Bruce and Dorrie Harding praise her and to see their eyes smile at her resourcefulness. There were days when she floated on air, dizzy with a passion of sacrifice. In those 2 weeks she experienced emotions that aged her by years. Roland had returned in the second week. The telegrams that Bruce had sent after him had failed to reach him for days. When he got them he rode furiously from Auckland in an almost impossible time, ruining a good horse in the process, to find he was only a cipher in the crisis. He had to live in the men's kitchen and was not allowed to see Alice till the 3rd week. He behaved perfectly and made no trouble for anybody. In a situation where he knew he was no use, he was surprisingly tractable. In telling him of the accident, Bruce spoke plainly. "Your wife ought never to be left alone. She is far too highly strung." "Well, she doesn't have to be. "I didn't know she was nervous. She never said anything. In future you'd better look after her when I'm away." Bruce had not expected this. He had thought of Eliza King. He could not help smiling at Roland's simple and natural suggestion. "Mrs. Roland might object to that," he said. "Ah, pooh. She's got to get used to it." "Well, Bob Hargraves or somebody would always be available. And here's another thing. You won't mind me saying it. No woman ought to do heavy lifting. We men are damned thoughtless about those things. I found Mrs. Roland lifting that camp oven the very day of her illness. That alone might be enough to injure her for life." "I see," said the boss gratefully. "She doesn't have to lift it. If she'd only told me." "I know," said Bruce. Roland had this conversation in mind the first time he was allowed to talk to Alice. As she sat propped up in bed, he sat affectionately beside her, holding her hand. The fact that he had missed the telegrams because he was having a honeymoon with an adventurous widow drove him to an excessive demonstration of care. He was always beginning afresh, seeing very clearly himself that he was about to improve. His way was paved with good intentions. But he forgot that when other people looked behind they saw not even the ghost of a good intention, but only the substantial footprints of ill-considered deeds. He was now in a mood to make all sorts of amends. "Why didn't you tell me you were nervous?" he plunged. "You don't have to be alone. Whenever I'm away you can have Bruce here. I've told him." Wildly startled, Alice stared at him. "But you know that can't be," she explained. "Can't be? Fiddlesticks. Why?" "Why?" She did not know what she meant. "Think how people would talk," she added lamely. "People! Bunkum! Where are they? The men, do you mean? I'd shoot any damned one of 'em who even mentioned the subject. But they won't mention it. They've got good sense. And even if they don't know you, they know Bruce. There's nothing to worry about in that." And that was all he saw in it. Alice lay back gasping. "And look here," he went on, "for God's sake, tell me when you want that camp oven moved. You can't expect me to think of everything, and I don't know when you want things done unless you tell me. You don't have to lift it or anything else. And when I'm away there are plenty of men about. You can trust 'em. They're not savages." He thought he was doing quite well, and he could not understand why she lay back white and cold. He began to tap his feet nervously. With a glimmer of understanding, Alice began to ask him questions about people they knew in Auckland, and in return he tried to be newsy. But when Mrs. King told him it was time for him to go, he got up with a sense of relief, and whistling cheerfully to hide his conviction of failure, he went out, resolved to go to the new cottage of Bob Jones, his head contractor, to see if he could assist the newly arrived bride, a buxom and cheerful girl, to get settled. Later in the evening Dorrie reported to Bruce that Alice had some fever. "Lord, I hope he didn't tell her anything. If she is wakeful, give her a powder," he advised. Alice needed the powder. After her husband left her, her thoughts began to whirl in circles round her brain. She could not think a sentence to the end. Bruce had talked about the camp oven. Everyone knew she was nervous. Bruce had never been near her. Had he been? Why didn't he come? She didn't want him to come. What had he said about the camp oven? Why had he said it? Who had found her that night? It must have been Bruce. Was it Bruce? Who sent for Mrs. King? Had Dr. Mount really come? Who was the man in the shadows? Had there been a man? Who buried the baby? Who was the man in the yard? What had made her ill? Was it the camp oven? Why didn't Bruce come to see her, just as a doctor? And so on, a maddening medley without beginning and without end. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Story of a New Zealand River by Jane Mander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. One afternoon, a fortnight later, Alice sat in her rocker by the sitting-room fire with Asia reading The Inevitable Boy's Own on the sacking mat beside her. She was now able to be up most of the day, and was so much better that Mrs. King had left to go to another case. Mrs. Harding had gone this evening to have dinner with Mrs. Brayton, leaving Asia in charge of her mother. Roland had been all day in the bush, but was expected back for tea, which Dorrie had left prepared in the kitchen. Alice had not recuperated as well as Bruce thought she ought to, considering the great care and attention she had received, and he was wondering what it was that was holding her back. He knew that she had asked many questions about her illness, but he gathered that Mrs. Harding had successfully kept the real facts from her. He thought it hardly likely that she was grieving over the baby to the extent that her nerves indicated. With that inconvenient insight that so many introspective women possess, Alice suspected that she had not been given the true facts of her illness. As she grew better, she began to wonder what they were hiding from her. She knew now that David Bruce had been at the house a good deal, even though she had no clear memory of him. She knew that he still came, for she heard his voice in the kitchen in the evenings, but she had never seen him, and she was appalled to find out how much she wanted to see him. In those 2 weeks, as she sat at the sitting-room window, she had looked for him about the spit in the tramway. Once, when she had seen him near the shore, she had felt the quick fever in her veins painting itself upon her face and neck. She sternly fought these relapses. She told herself she must not allow any sentimental feeling about his connection with her illness to drive her into thinking of him. Again and again she repeated her little formula about not beginning. Then she would get angry with him for ignoring her now that she was well. As a matter of common courtesy, she argued, if not as a doctor, he should have come to see her. Her illness should have brought about a natural acquaintance between them. He should have seen that, and should not have held her to her mistake. It was his opportunity to ignore it. The natural antagonism between these two views wore on her nerves. As she sat by the fire with Asia, it occurred to her that she had not had the opportunity of talking to her. The more she thought of it, the more she saw significance in the fact that she had been alone very little with her. Of course the child had been very useful and had worked unceasingly. Emotion stirred her as she looked down at her. Was she imagining, or did Asia look different? Had she been able to enter into the atmosphere of serious illness to any degree? Alice remembered the curious expression on her face as she had stood beside her bed. Suspicion entered her mind. She determined to find out what she knew. "Asia, how long was Dr. Mount here when I was ill?" she asked suddenly. She saw the child hesitate and answer without looking up. "I don't know, Mother. I didn't see him come." "Did you see him at all?" demanded Alice. "No, they didn't let me in." Asia began to feel uncomfortable. She did hope her mother was not going to ask her any questions. She was not quite sure now what they had told her to say, and it was one thing to be told to say it, and another to look into her mother's eyes and lie to her. "Were you asleep when I got ill?" pursued her mother. "I heard you fall, Mother, and I ran for Mr. Bruce." That was both safe and true. "Go on," said Alice. "Oh, Mother, don't ask me questions. I don't remember," she burst out, torn between the desire to keep the secret faithfully and not to deceive her mother. Alice drew herself up, an unreasoning rage taking possession of her. "Asia," and she charged the word with ominous solemnity, "you must tell me all you know. Who has dared to tell you that you are not to talk to your own mother? Tell me that." Asia sprang to her feet in dire distress. "Mother, you will be ill again. Nobody told me." She lied bravely. "But everyone says you mustn't be worried, and now you're getting worried." Alice saw her advantage. She calmed herself. "I am not worried. I am quite well now, and you must answer my questions. It will worry me if you don't. Now don't be afraid. You are my child, and nobody has any right to tell you what to do with me. Would you let anything come between you and your mother?" Alice felt this was perfectly fair, but she was inwardly furious to see that Asia did not seem convinced. It was the first time in her life that any influence had worked against her own with regard to her. She deliberately ignored the possibility that it had been done to save her. The fact that it had been done was enough to make her blind. "Answer my questions. After you got Mr. Bruce, you took a message to Bob Hargraves, and he went for Mrs. King." "Yes, Mother." "Did you go to bed then?" "I got some hot water for Mr. Bruce, and then I went to bed." "Asia," cried her mother furiously, "you are telling me lies. You did not go back to bed. Who told you to tell this story to me?" The child drew away frightened and miserable, feeling herself trapped in a tangle of things she could say and things she must not say, and she did not know now what her mother had been told or what she knew. "Oh, dear," she said pitifully, half to herself. That convinced Alice. "Did Mr. Bruce tell you that you were not to say anything?" Her voice hardened, and in that moment she believed she hated him. "Oh, Mother," Asia was trembling, "don't be angry with us. I don't understand it a bit, but it was all to make you well. I will tell you if you are well. I was awake." Alice tried once more to calm herself. "Yes, and you helped Mr. Bruce. Now go on, tell me about it. When did Mrs. King come?" "Well, it seemed a long time. I'd got everything ready. Oh, Mother, I can't tell you everything if you look like that. What is the matter with you? Are you ill?" Alice realized that Asia was afraid of her, but she was not in a mood to think of her. She was fast getting to the borderland where accumulated anger becomes blind passion. "Come here," she cried furiously, but Asia hardly moved. "Do you hear me?" "Oh, Mother, do sit down or I shall run away. I don't like you when you look like that. You are not like my mother." Asia continued to sob. Alice stood still, wondering if she heard her aright. What had happened to her worshipping, obedient child? The thought that something had come between them drove her to a frenzy of rage. "You won't obey me? Oh, this is outrageous. I forbid you ever to talk to Mr. Bruce again. You are never to go near him again. You are never to speak to him again. Never, for any reason at all. Do you hear me?" Asia stared at her, fierce rebellion choking her. Passionately as she reverenced her mother, she knew she could not yield to her in this. She had rarely defied her, even in a small way, and she had never before flatly disobeyed her. But as she stood there, distracted by the inexplicableness of it all, something in her rose up to fight. "I will talk to Mr. Bruce," she cried, and then, turning from her mother's terrible eyes, she fled outside. But even in that volcanic moment she remembered that she was supposed to be taking care of Alice. She stopped sobbing by the cliffs. She was sick with fright and bewilderment. It was horrible that things could be so sudden and so stupid. What had she done? What had Mr. Bruce done to cause her mother to act like that? She saw only one explanation. Her mother must still be ill, and now she had made her worse again. As she stood there she saw Bruce leave the store. Impulsively she rushed down to him. "What's the matter?" he asked sharply as she ran towards him. "Mother is so angry with us," she gasped, tears dripping from her cheeks. "She says I'm never to talk to you again." Bruce looked sternly at her. "What has happened? What have you been telling her?" "I didn't tell her. I tried not to, but she would ask me questions, and she seemed to know. She said she knew I was not in bed. I didn't know what to say, and she said I must tell her." "Oh, Lord!" exclaimed Bruce. Asia burst into fresh tears. "Oh, I couldn't help it. Don't you be angry." "Shh, child." He put his hands on her shoulders. "Don't worry any more. It can't be helped. Mrs. Harding was going to tell her all about it in a day or two. I understand why she is angry, but never mind. She will understand when she is told. It will come out all right." "But she looks so awful. She will be ill again. She is ill, isn't she?" "Yes," he said gently, "she is ill. And sick people often get angry at what seems to be nothing. But don't worry about her. Who is with her now?" "Nobody. Mrs. Harding went up to Mrs. Brayton for dinner. We thought Mother was well enough." "I see. Well, I'm going to talk to her. You stay outside till I go." He turned up the bank. Alice stood frozen for some minutes after Asia ran out. Then she sank choking into her rocker, those last defiant words ringing like a death knell in her ears. Asia had been one of her eternal verities. She had never allowed herself to think of a day when the child might combat her opinions, or question her beliefs, or dispute her commands. Much of her suppressed emotionalism had found vent in the affection between them. To her the bond had been more than human. She had been sure of her right and of her power to dominate her own child. In spite of Mrs. Brayton's hint, she was still sure of her right, for her feelings died hard, fighting to the last ditch. But her sense of power had now received its first stunning shock. In that mad moment she did not stop to think or analyze. She only saw that Bruce was a rival influence. As she sat lashing herself into a fever, the front door opened and Bruce walked in and closed it behind him. For a moment she was so taken aback that she could not move. She felt a wave of helplessness closing down upon her. Then she remembered, her nerves snapped, and she sprang to her feet. "How dare you enter my house like that? Leave it at once," she cried. But he moved towards her. He saw she was in a white heat and on the border of hysteria. "Please sit down, Mrs. Roland. I want to talk to you." His calm inattention made her want to scream at him. She had never been in such a state in her life. "I will not sit down. Leave my house," she almost shouted. He was vividly conscious of her dramatic appearance. At last she had come to life. Her blue-grey eyes blazed with unsuspected passion. Her face, thin and whitened by her illness, was flushed to a deep crimson. Her tall and graceful figure was terribly alive with the fire of maternal rage. But Bruce looked anxiously at her, at a loss how to quieten her. "Do sit down, Mrs. Roland. I can explain." "Explain! Nothing could ever explain. You talked to my child. You told her not to tell me. You took advantage of a situation. I don't care what happened. It could have been avoided. It was outrageous. You presumed disgracefully. You had no business in this house in my husband's absence. You should have got a doctor to stay. Nothing can explain. There could be no excuse. To teach that child to lie to her mother. Will you go out of this house?" She gasped for breath. Bruce kept his eyes steady against hers, hoping to dominate her. "You will understand when you hear," he began quietly. But she was beyond reason. "I shall tell my husband that I ordered you out of this house and that you refused to go." She choked, and sweeping past him, she entered her room and locked the door behind her. Even though he knew that she did not know what she was saying, Bruce was hurt, and he was annoyed to think that he could not manage her. He understood her anger, and he was sure that when the inevitable explanation was fully made she would be ashamed of her outburst. But he knew that her shame would not improve the strained relations between them, that, in fact, it would only make them more difficult. And it hurt him to be at variance with any human being. He stood for a few minutes outside to think how it could now be straightened out. Spun from a gold and crimson sunset, a wavering fringe of colour undulated upon the cold ripple of the river. The chill of winter put a sting into the evening air. Down below him, along the tramway and on the spit, the men were gathering up their tools. He saw Roland riding along the edge of the bay. He had a curious feeling of being utterly apart from this nest of people whose affairs dovetailed, and whose motives and reactions, often inexplicable to themselves, were an open book to him. He went down to tell Roland what it was advisable for him to know of the incident just past, and to tell Asia how to treat her mother. For some time after she fell upon her bed, Alice lay sobbing weakly, conscious only of the physical results of her outburst. If she moved, she felt dizzy. Her head ached abominably. Her feet grew cold. She lay in a delirium of misery till Asia tapped at her door. "I'm bringing your tea, Mother," she called in matter-of-fact tones. Alice remembered that her door was locked. "Put it down," she called thickly. She forced herself to get up, bringing the tray, and drink a little of the hot milk. Then she undressed and got into bed. She drew the sheet half over her face as she heard someone come to the door. But Asia did not speak to her as she put 2 hot water bottles into the bed and drew the blinds and left the front window open at the bottom. Somehow Alice knew that David Bruce had been telling her just what to do. If she could possibly have grown any more miserable as the evening advanced, she would have. But even her capacity for misery was limited. She tried to still her uncomfortable questions by telling herself that her anger was justified, that what she had said was true, that nothing could ever excuse Bruce. Then she remembered that she did not yet know whether the lies that they had told her might not hide a situation that had not before occurred to her because it was so unthinkable, a situation that she shrank from now and refused to think about. She was still refusing to think about it when Dorrie Harding stole into her room. Alice pretended to be asleep. Dorrie renewed the hot water bottles, put milk and biscuits on the table beside her, raised the window a little, and went out. Nobody came near her again, but she heard voices in the kitchen till midnight. She knew they were discussing her. She knew they were excusing her because she was ill. She remembered the anxiety in Bruce's eyes that evening while she was raving at him. But this conspiracy of carefulness and understanding only threw into greater relief her own ignominious position as the person to be excused. She spent a wretched night, wondering how she was ever to look any of them in the face again, and craving to get away from every single one of them. "It's going to be damned difficult," Bruce had said to Mrs. Harding and Mrs. Brayton, "but it ought to be done now as soon as possible, tomorrow if you can." He had gone up to bring Mrs. Harding home because he wanted to talk to her apart from Roland. They sat in the library before a comforting fire. "Oh, I can't do it," groaned Mrs. Harding. "She's an awful person to tell anything to. What is the matter with her?" "Pride and Puritanism, those monumental bulwarks of the British character," growled Bruce. The two women laughed. "Your explanations are simple, but they don't help," said Mrs. Harding. "Can't you imagine her face when she is told that you were alone with her when the baby was born?" "Poor thing," he said gently. "Yes, that will be an awful dose, and she will never be able to endure the sight of me again. Really, it's a devil of a situation, and yet it is so human and natural. Oh, Lord." "I'll tell her," broke in Mrs. Brayton. "I'll go down in the morning. I'm not belittling your talents," she smiled at Dorrie, "but I think she will take it better from me." "Oh, you are a brick," cried Dorrie. "I've never dreaded anything so much in my life, and I'm afraid I'd lose patience with her. She's so stupid." "My dear, think of her upbringing. Father, a Presbyterian minister of the old school, wouldn't even allow Scott's novels in the house. Mother died when she was a child. One brother a missionary. A daily round of prayer meetings. No wonder she ran off and got married. And then I'm sure there was something funny about the marriage too." "Oh, I know there are excuses for her, but lots of us have had Puritan upbringing, and we are not as bad as she is." "The great trouble with her is that she can't be inconsistent," said Bruce gloomily. "She can't forget this week what she felt like last week. She began wrong with me, and she can't forget it. 10 years hence she will remember that she was rude to me this afternoon, and she will want to apologize for it all over again." They laughed. "Come on, Mrs. Harding, we must get back. I told Roland not to go near her. He's a blunderer, but there's no telling what he may do. And that poor child, she will have brain fever if anything more happens." "I'll be down about 10," Mrs. Brayton called from the veranda as they went through the garden. It was with some misgivings that the old lady walked into Alice's room the next morning. She saw at once that Alice knew why she had come, and so she began without any preliminaries. "My dear," she said as she sat down beside her, "perhaps we have all made a mistake, but we did it for the best, and you must forgive us." Then Alice saw that whatever the conspiracy had been, they were all in it. Not that that added to her peace of mind. She knew that she was going to hear something dreadful, and she braced herself to get it over without any exhibition of feeling. Her head was aching badly, for she had hardly slept, but she was glad of it because it distracted her attention and helped her keep aloof. Mrs. Brayton found it very difficult to talk to her because she asked no questions, and only twice repeated a word or two as if she had not heard aright. Mrs. Brayton was careful to put no emphasis on the things she knew Alice would emphasize. She lightened the details, and she treated the whole situation as a thing common in that environment. And by assuming that Alice would see it in a certain light once she was told, she planted a seed that after something of a struggle vitalized into a plant, a feeble one, indeed, but still a plant. Mrs. Harding dropped in twice to break up the impression that this was a solemn conclave. She brought in chicken jelly and biscuits and refilled the hot water bottle. She, too, took the attitude that they were people who had blundered. "We did it for the best," she said, echoing Mrs. Brayton. The whole story beat upon Alice's brain as a string of words that merely added to her misery without helping her to think. She wondered if she would ever be able to think again. When it was over and Mrs. Brayton had gone softly out, after squeezing her hand and telling her she must get well, she lay stupidly holding her head. She felt as if the sap had been bled out of her, leaving only a physical shell that ached because of the void inside it. As she lay with her eyes closed, Asia brought in her lunch. "Mother, dear, will you get well quick now, won't you?" The child beamed at her, but a look of disappointment killed her smile as she saw her mother's eyes. "Oh, Mother, do you have a headache?" Alice nodded. She could not trust herself to speak. "Let me bathe it." Alice nodded again. That headache was one of the worst she had ever had. At 9 o'clock that night Bruce told Mrs. Harding to give her morphine. She was stupid the next day from the effects of the drug, and dozed uneasily, taking little notice of anybody. "How has she been today?" Bruce asked on the second evening. "Awfully listless," answered Dorrie. "She wouldn't get up, poor thing. She has tried dreadfully hard all day to be pleasant, but she has hardly looked at any of us." I'll see what I can do with her," he smiled. Dorrie wondered what would happen as she saw him disappear into the front bedroom. Alice lay with her eyes closed, her face shaded from the one candlelight by 2 empty canisters that had been placed round it. Her masses of chestnut hair tumbled about her head. Her cheeks were tinged with colour. Her eyes opened, dilated and blazed as Bruce, without any announcement, walked in, closed the door behind him, and drew a chair beside her. As he sat down he was conscious that he had electrified her. She was looking at him like a bird fascinated by a snake. He realized, too, that when she looked alive she was beautiful. But it was merely as a doctor, a psychologist, that he leaned over her. "Mrs. Roland," he began gravely, "do you enjoy being ill?" She looked helplessly into his steady eyes, feeling that they knew everything about her. She made no attempt to reply. "There is nothing wrong with you now but your mind, and you have made it sick, and you are keeping it sick. You can get well as soon as you please. Now, why don't you? What good do you think you're doing yourself or your children or anybody else? You are thinking only of yourself." She was startled by this unexpected plainness. He was making no excuses for her. He was speaking with the dispassionateness of a stranger, making no effort to be soft or kind. "Do you know what you are doing? You are making a luxury of misery. It's a common disease, but you ought to be above it. Now exert your willpower. You can get well at once. Health is too fine a thing to be fooled as you are fooling it. If you don't like the past, forget it. Forget everything you don't like." He stood up. "You get up tomorrow and walk round the house twice every hour if it is fine, and breathe all the fresh air you can, and above all things," with slow emphasis, "give that inconvenient memory of yours a rest. Good night." Before she knew what she was doing she had put her hot weak hand into his cool firm one that closed round it with a grip she felt for hours, and then he was gone, leaving her aflame from head to foot. "She's afraid of me. Now why the devil?" he said to himself as he went out. Bruce's words did not help Alice to get to sleep, but before she began to think of them she held in her memory the picture of his face as it had looked down at her, the patience, the tiredness, the tragedy of his eyes, and she admitted that it was to her one of the most beautiful faces she had ever seen. She wondered why it did not seem to matter that he had done for her supremely intimate things, even that she had been rude to him. He seemed remote from such personal matters, so much bigger than any of the things she worried about. His presence had blotted out the past. His words carried her into the future. His curt sentences came back one by one into her mind, and one by one she said them over to herself until she had them all set out in a row, as it were, for inspection. The mere repetition of them fired her with energy and determination. She saw that though life had beaten her into the dust, she had to get up and face it again. Though she hardly slept, she got up after she had had her breakfast and began the walks. Through the morning she had lived on his mentality, but as the day wore on she began to get back to her own. She craved to be alone to think, for she knew that when the excitement died down in her she would begin to think. She wished Dorrie Harding would go home. It was so hard to meet her eyes impersonally. The only person she could bear to see was Asia, who was so easily diverted from the unpleasant, who so soon forgot the yesterdays, who did not look at her with eyes that veiled remembrance. When she was not walking round the house she sat at the sitting room window. She told herself that she needed all the sunlight she could get. And it was not the sun's fault that she was disappointed when the evening came. She had to admit to herself that the afternoon had been a failure because she had not caught a glimpse of David Bruce. As she went to bed she knew she wanted him to come to see her again. But hearing from Mrs. Harding that she was much better, Bruce did not enter the house. Instead, Alice had a short visit from her husband, who said that now that she was well he would come home the next day, and the following morning he mentioned that instead of going away himself on business he was sending Bruce. All day Alice wondered when he was going, and if he would come to see her before he left. She was hurt and then angry that he did not. When she heard Roland tell someone at the front door that he would be away a month, she was frightened to find that it was a shock to her. She saw again what she was coming to, and that she must discipline her mind in order to fight her impulses. In the course of the following weeks, free from the excitement of possible visits by Bruce, Increasingly occupied with the return to her normal life, the departure of Mrs. Harding, and the return of the children, Alice fought out once more the disagreeably active waywardness of her feelings, and defined again her duty as a Christian wife and mother. She realized that the situation was a complicated one. Instead of feeling embarrassed that Bruce had been her doctor, she was now particularly drawn to him on that account. Instead of hating him and disliking to see him because she had shamefully misunderstood him, she longed to humiliate herself in an orgy of submission to him. Instead of blaming him, she now felt Asia's love for him to be a further bond. She admitted to herself that if she did not actually love him, she was on the borderland, and she knew that she would have to go on seeing him, that he might have to doctor her again, that there was no question of his going away. She knew that she could not be rude to him any longer. She knew that Mrs. Brayton and Dorrie Harding had made allowances for her up to the present, but that they would condemn her for any further stupidity. And she knew that she could not bear their condemnation. At the same time she dreaded to think what might be the outcome of intimacy between her and David Bruce. She still believed in the inviolability of marriage, even in thought as the first plank of morality. It was a week or more before it occurred to her to wonder if Bruce cared or might care for her. She went over all that he had done for her. She thought long over the exciting fact that he, unknown to her, had guarded her and her children those nights before her accident. She thought over everything he had said and done, but nowhere could she find the sign that she hoped and feared to find. She knew that if he ever grew to care for her and told her so, she would be helpless against any advances he might make. It was bad enough, she told herself, that she be in danger of loving him. She must prevent by every means in her power his caring for her. In a clear-sighted moment she admitted that, owing to her past behaviour, the latter might be the least difficult of her tasks. She decided that it rested entirely with herself, but this decision was not as comforting as she felt it should have been. She prayed long and earnestly that God would reinforce her feeble will with some of that mysterious strength she had been taught to believe was available for those who desired truly to help themselves. She wavered between strong moments when she knew Providence was on her side and weak moments when she saw no evidence that he was. David Bruce was away for 5 weeks, first up the Wairoa, arranging for further timber shipments, and then in Auckland, hunting up men for the bushwork and buying machinery. In a weak moment he had succumbed to drinking whiskey with the secretary of the Kauri Timber Company, and had been dead to the world for days afterwards. He bore little outward sign of this relapse on his return to the bay, but it was the reason why he did not go near the boss's house for a fortnight. Then, on a wet Sunday afternoon, he appeared at the back door with a brace of pheasants. Alice was in the kitchen getting the tea when she heard the knock. As she had not heard any footsteps, she opened the door quite unprepared. Bruce ignored her start and her flush. "I bagged these this morning, Mrs. Roland, the first I've had time to shoot this season. I would like you to have them." He held out the birds. "Oh, thank you. It's very kind," she stammered, taking them mechanically. "Don't mention it. I had fun getting them. I'm glad to see you are better." And lifting his cap, he turned away, seeing that she was uncomfortable at the sight of him. But he made up his mind that she should get used to the sight of him, and that he would find some excuse for calling 2 or 3 times a week. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Story of a New Zealand River by Jane Mander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Alice sat on a box in the back garden, looking down the river. The sun had set, but opaline ghosts of clouds still trailed their ravelled fleeces across the pale lemon of the western sky. The cliffs of the river gap were fast merging into the wall of haze that deepened and spread from the horizon. The river ran silently, undisturbed by leaping fish. The wekas were just beginning to shriek from the forest. Alice drew her heavy cape around her, for the tang of winter was still in the air. She had seen that day the glow of a yellow coal fire in the bush, and had heard the croaky call of a tui trying out his throat in readiness for his flute song on the first real day of spring. Bees had buzzed about their garden, and Asia had declared that morning that she had found the first daffodil bud in her own little flower bed. but the promise of spring had failed to inspire Alice. There was no response in her as she sat there looking down upon the river. She had spent a winter of glorious discontent. The more she had tried to prop herself against her gods, the more she had tried to console herself with fixed principles, the more inadequate she had found them. They had not kept her from looking through the windows to watch for David Bruce as he came and went along the paths about the bay. They had not kept her from listening to his violin. They had not kept her from flushing when she met him unexpectedly. The biggest cause of her uneasiness was that she had begun to question the verities. If you live beside a river, sooner or later you have to. You can't help sitting beside it and listening to it and watching the water go by. And then you wonder idly where all the water comes from and where it goes, and when it began to run and why, and if it will ever end and why. And your thoughts run with it and change with it. And you go out at night to look at the stars reflected in the dark depths of it, and then you look up at the stars themselves and you ask when and why again. And little by little you wonder if all that men have said about them is true, and who the first man was who said it, and you would like to be quite sure that he was inspired by God. And that brings you to God. Is he up there, and what does he look like? And when you begin to wonder what God looks like, you have reached the halfway house to the heights of skepticism. He must look like something or somebody, but whom and what? And does he really hear your prayers? And does he really care? And if he does not hear your prayers, what then? And if he does not care, what then? Alice had reached a stage of mental convulsions when she no longer clearly saw God in his heaven and all right with the world. Other fears, too, had been closing in upon her, fears that she could not crush or sweep aside. She had never been really well since her illness in the autumn. Lately, the conviction had grown upon her that the first blow had been struck in her fine health. She was getting nerves. She became more and more nauseated by the terrible vitality of her husband. It was being stimulated this very day, she knew, by the sportive widow who had recently bought the Hakaru pub. Roland had not disguised the fact that he was going to see her. She was a good sensible woman, he said, and he wanted her to pick out likely men among her customers and send them to him for jobs. Alice had not remarked aloud that it took a good many visits to arrange this simple matter. Then, for 2 weeks now, she had feared that she was going to have another child. She had not expected to feel so badly about it. She had married knowing she would have children, that it was her duty to have them, that God approved of large families, that she ought to love and welcome all her children, and that she ought to feel a renewed exultation in the knowledge that another was to come. But now she did not feel any of these things. She felt only a dumb rage, a sick helplessness, a fierce rebellion. And she had wondered more than once if it really was as wicked as she had been told to rebel against the word of God. Everything immediately around her this Sunday conspired to drive her to distraction. The children had been unusually exasperating, and Asia, who could have helped her, had been away. Alice did not know where, the whole afternoon. She had merely asked her mother if she could go for a walk along the beach. For some time Alice had not been alarmed about her, thinking she might have gone to Mrs. Brayton. But now it was dark, and she knew the old lady would not have allowed her to stay so late. She fidgeted on her box, straining her ears for the sound of returning footsteps. Her fear soon got the best of her. She began to walk round the house listening and looking, and feeling worse every minute. On her second round she stopped, her eyes turned towards a new shanty standing by itself at the foot of the green hill, well away from the back of the men's kitchen. Bruce had moved into it only a few days before. Alice had learned from Asia, whom she had allowed to go to see it, that it had a carpet, a stretcher bed, books, tables, a cupboard for his clothes, and a special box for his violin. She had looked so often in its direction that she hoped no one had noticed. She could not tell now whether he was home or not, for she knew that his western window had a thick green blind. As she looked, she felt a sudden desire to go to him, and then an equally strong determination to fight this desire. She looked upon her attitude to Bruce that winter as her one great achievement. Although it still upset her inwardly to meet him, she felt that outwardly she had gained in poise. She had met his naturalness with what she thought was naturalness in return. She had been pleasant, but she never relaxed her vigilance as to the beginning. She had never asked him in. She never let conversation linger. She always assumed that he had urgent business with her husband. She knew that he must think it extraordinary that she had never referred to her illness, that she had never thanked him for what he had done for her. She had never sent for him. She had never stayed in the sitting room on the evenings when he worked with her husband. It tortured her to think that he must despise her, but she saw no other way of going on. Now, however, the temptation to send for him grew more irresistible every minute. The better to fight it, she went inside. She paced restlessly from the kitchen to the front room and back again, torn between her fear that something had happened to Asia and her craving to go for the man who could best help her. She looked into her room to see that Betty and Mabel were safely asleep, and had turned into the kitchen again, distracted, when Asia rushed in, bursting with excitement, her eyes aflame with adventure, far too preoccupied to notice the state of her mother's nerves. "Oh, Mother," she panted, "we've found a cave and Maori shells and bones and this beautiful bit of greenstone." But there was no response to her enthusiasm. Alice's reaction was swift and overwhelming. "We?" she said sternly. Asia felt a sudden chill. "It was only Reggie Broad, Mother. I met him on the beach. We explored some bush, just like a real party. It—" But the words froze on her lips. She could no longer face her mother's eyes. "Reggie Broad went with you into the bush?" With a sinking feeling, Asia felt that it was an awful accusation. Reggie Broad was a coarse, rough boy, the son of the Kaiwaka storeman, who had recently come up from Auckland. Alice realized his type, but to Asia he was a mine of information and amusement. They had had a thrilling and innocently joyous afternoon. That was all she knew. She faced her mother squarely. "We didn't hurt anything," she said. Alice moved a step towards her. She was now thoroughly unstrung. "How long were you with him?" "Oh, I don't know, Mother," she stammered. "Since dinner we didn't do anything wrong." "You've been for hours in the bush with that boy?" Asia choked as her mother seized her by the shoulder and hurried her into her own room. Then she left her, shutting the door behind her, only to return a moment later with a strap. As the child saw the horrible thing that was about to happen, she became faint. "You wicked girl," cried Alice, grasping her arm. "How could you go away like that with that boy? You should have come to ask me. I don't know what's come over you lately. You must not do things unless you ask me. You must never speak to him again. Do you hear me? You are never to talk to boys or go anywhere with them. I must make you remember it." The suddenness and inexplicableness of this first beating turned Asia into a raving little demon. "I hate you! I hate you!" she shouted at her mother. "I hate God. I don't believe there is any. I like Mr. Bruce better than you. He wouldn't beat me for nothing. What have I done? Go away. I hate you. You'll never be my mother again. I won't live with you. I hate you." And then howls and shrieks of rage. "Oh, you wicked girl," gasped Alice, astonished and frightened by this outburst. Asia did not realize for some minutes afterwards that she was alone. She screamed and howled, goading herself to frenzy. When she had exhausted herself, she staggered to her window, cautiously pushed it up, and dropped out. She shot off in the dust to the cliff, where she scrambled and slid down by the roots of the big totara to the sand, and with nothing in her mind but the desire to get away alone, she ran sobbing and whimpering along the beach to a little wooded dell, a fern-bowered spot, beloved of yellowhammers and moreporks and tuis, and enlivened by the cheerfulest of streams that trickled over polished rocks into the tide below. The dell was Asia's Bible. If the babies had been very cross, she stole off to it to calm her fretted nerves. If she failed to reach Alice's standard of patience in looking for the cow or in keeping the fowls out of the vegetables, it was to the dell she went to have it out with her turbulent soul. She reached it now breathless, falling down in the grass on a small headland that stretched out into the mangroves. There she lay dazed for over an hour. Then her lips began to twitch, and with a rush came the scalding tears. "She beat me," she choked at intervals, broken-hearted. "She beat me." She drew up her aching body and sat with her chin on her knees, trying to find a reason for it, trying to believe it all a hideous dream, trying to think of the mother she had known that morning, the mother she now felt was gone forever. She turned her swollen face to the stars. "Oh, why did she beat me?" she moaned. "I can't understand it a bit." She kept her face strained upwards to the stars, hard as crystal in the cold sky. But they did not comfort her or divert her from the tragedy of her wrecked world. She looked wildly round the dell and onto the still river, both things she had grown to love, but there was no comfort there either, no voice to reassure her or tell her it was all a mistake. As she sat on, anger began to take the place of bewilderment and sorrow. She felt the beating had been unjust. It had fallen upon her out of a clear sky. She had not known it was wrong to go away with Reggie, and why was it wrong? She puzzled over this till she realized suddenly that it must be very late, later than she had ever been out before. She sprang to her feet and turned mechanically homewards. Then she remembered that her mother might be angry again and beat her again. It never occurred to her that Alice might be anxious about her. Suddenly she felt she could not go home. She did not love her mother any more. She could not bear to face her. She wondered if she could not sleep in the monkey house she had made for herself in the tea tree in the dell. But it was cold and she was shivering. She began to weep pitifully, like a lost child. Then she remembered Mrs. Brayton. It was 11 o'clock, and the old lady was undressing when she heard a step on her veranda and a knock on her window pane. "Who is it?" she called. "Asia," in a voice hardly recognizable. Good gracious! Mrs. Brayton hurried with her candle to the front door. "Child," she cried, "what has happened?" Poor Asia stumbled in with a fresh rush of tears. "She beat me," she sobbed, clinging to the amazed old lady. It was some time before anything else could be got from her, but bit by bit Mrs. Brayton pieced together the story. After closing the door upon Asia, Alice went into her room and fell into her rocking chair, crushing her hands into her temples. Paralyzing reactions always followed her rare outbursts. It was some minutes before she could think. Then a wave of remorse swept over her. She knew she had been cruelly unjust, that she had done the child a wrong she could never right, and that it would haunt her for years. The sight of Asia's agonized and bewildered face, distorted out of all recognition, danced before her, and the things the child had said rang in her ears. Was it possible that her own lack of control had so affected Asia that she raged blindly, or was she saying what she believed? The thought appalled her. She pressed her fingers into her eyeballs to blot out the sight. She closed her hands over her ears to shut out the sound of those defiant cries. Then she began to cry, and all the pent-up feelings of that day and the weeks before it found an outlet in her drenching tears. She told herself she was a wicked woman and that she deserved to suffer. At last, weak and pulverized, she got up, bathed her face, and went to make up the kitchen fire, which had burned low. The tea that she had prepared stood untouched, the 2 chairs ready for herself and Asia. Alice was faint with hunger, but she could not eat alone. She knew that before she did anything else she must apologize. An apology was to her an absurdly momentous affair. An apology to her own child was entirely outside her experience. It was the first time she had ever felt called upon to make one. Nobody could ever know what it meant to her to walk into Asia's door, open it, and go in. It meant so much that it was a minute or two before she realized that the room was empty. "Asia," she muttered stupidly, staring at the open window. As she was sure the child must be somewhere near, she went outside and round the house, calling softly. She looked in the woodshed, she walked to the back fence, and she called up into the field and over towards the cliffs. Then she wondered if Asia had gone to David Bruce. The thought that she might have told him the story filled her cup of humiliation to overflowing. But when she went inside and saw that it was long after 9 o'clock, she knew this had not happened, for Bruce would not have kept her so late. For some time she fought the suspicion that kept coming to her mind. She walked from room to room with the restlessness of a wolf in a cage, getting more worked up with every step she took. At 10 o'clock, as she stood desperate in the kitchen, resolved finally to go for Bruce, she heard steps. For the minute she thought they were his, but it was Roland who opened the back door. "Hullo," he began gaily. "What's up?" His face was flushed. "I can't find Asia. She has been away for hours. I'm sure something has happened to her." "Oh, nonsense," he replied, failing to gauge her state of mind. "You're always alarmed about nothing. She'll turn up presently." And moving forward with some show of affection, he put his arm round her and tried to kiss her. She sprang from him, her eyes blazing. "What do you mean?" she cried furiously. "Do you realize that my child may be lying drowned in the river? She has been away since midday." The lie was deliberate. "Will you go out at once and get men to look for her, or must I go myself?" He stared at her for a few seconds, too astonished by her outbreak to speak. She was something totally different from anything he had thought her to be. He was startled by the hate and disgust in her eyes. But he put that down to the frenzied state that he now saw she was in. "Heavens, yes. Don't get excited. I'll get them," he said impatiently. It was not till he got outside that he realized what a business it would be trying to find anyone at that time of night. But he went to the kitchen, where the men were nearly all in bed, and asked for volunteers. Every man got up and started out with what lanterns there were to search the bay and the bush around it, the boss leading. A little after 11 o'clock Bruce rode up to the stable near the kitchen and unsaddled and fed his horse. He had been away all day at Kaiwaka at a bad case and was tired and hungry. As he saw a dim light through the kitchen window, he decided he would get something to eat before going to his shanty. When he opened the door he rubbed his eyes to see if he were awake or dreaming. One nickel lamp, burning low and smelling vilely, intensified the unusualness of the scene. The place was silent, with the uncanny silence of a schoolroom at night. Not a man was visible. The dark blankets and nightshirts of all kinds trailed over the sides of the beds and on the floor, telling of unexpected haste and confusion. The green eyes of the kitchen cat surveyed him suspiciously from a deserted bunk. "What the devil!" exclaimed Bruce, backing suddenly and running to the corner of the building. He looked at once in the direction of the boss's house and saw that it was lit up. He caught a glimmer of 2 lights in the bush across the bay, and heard what he took to be a distant call and an answer. Without waiting to encourage his presentiment, he began to sprint for the cottage. As he neared it he saw that a figure standing by the front gate turned swiftly and moved towards him. Bruce was not prepared for his reception. Rushing to him, Alice clutched his arm with both her hands, her hot eyes boring the darkness. "Oh, have you found her?" she cried. Startled though he was, the healer in him came automatically to the surface. He caught and held her hands and looked into her face. "What is it, Mrs. Roland? I've been away all day, just got back. What's happened?" "Asia, she's lost." "Lost? How? Where?" "I don't know. She ran away. She may be drowned. For God's sake, do something." He still held her hands, and she looked as if she was about to fall against him. She had never consciously been so near to him before. He saw that her reserves had melted, but as that was not the time to speculate, he gripped her hands a little harder and spoke quickly. "I can do nothing till you tell me more. When did she run away, and why?" "It's my fault," she choked, the confession bursting from her, all her pride gone. I whipped her. She was away all afternoon with that boy, Reggie Broad. She came home about 6 and I was so nervous. I didn't think what I was doing. I beat her. It was all wrong, and when I went to look for her she was gone. She may be drowned." "She is not drowned or lost," he interrupted firmly. "It would never occur to the child to drown herself. She has gone out and cried herself to sleep somewhere, that's all. Are they looking for her?" His conviction and his presence steadied her, and she was conscious that he was still holding her hands. "Yes," she answered, dropping her eyes. "Where?" "Oh, all about, I think. But they haven't found her." Her voice broke again. "Has anyone gone to that little dell along the beach?" "I don't know. Or Mrs. Brayton, did you think of that? She might go there." "But she would have sent to say." "Yes, but it would take time. Mrs. Roland, go in and get hold of yourself and stop worrying. I'll get my horse. I know she is somewhere about. She is neither dead nor lost. She will be found soon." He gripped her hands intentionally. And, believing him, Alice felt the fever go out of her as she watched him run back to the kitchen. She stood listening to the sound of his galloping horse as it pounded along the path to the shore and on round the beach. Another kind of excitement welled up in her as she realized the significance of this meeting. She knew it had done something to her, snapped some restraint. At that moment she did not care what the results might be. Worn out but calmer, she went inside and lay down in Asia's room, confident now that Bruce would bring her back. Before he mounted, Bruce had looked into his shanty, as it occurred to him that Asia might have gone to him for comfort. As he rode along the beach, he guessed many of the reasons for this tragic blunder. Although he had not looked for the signs, he knew Alice might at any time find out that she was going to have another child, and that the knowledge of it and the fear of it would spell disaster to her nerves. He knew also that Roland had paid several visits to the Hakaru pub, not to drink, for he was almost a total abstainer, but because he was fond of the florid Mrs. Lyman, a very amusing and flattering person. He did not blame Roland. He understood why he went to Mrs. Lyman. Bruce had speculated with more or less chagrin that winter why it was that Alice continued to remain aloof from him. At times it amused him, but it always vaguely annoyed him. She was his first real failure in his management of human relations. He knew that more than one thing was responsible for her attitude. He refused to believe that embarrassment alone kept her from acknowledging adequately his service to her. He was not looking for thanks, but he knew she owed them to him. He had wondered lately if she behaved as she did because she could not bear to meet one who must know how her husband was acting, because she could not meet eyes that saw too much. But then she obviously loved Mrs. Brayton, who knew and saw as much as he did. David Bruce knew that he attracted women, though he never traded on the fact. But it had not occurred to him that he had attracted Alice Roland because he did not see sufficient opportunity. Now, however, as she had stood near to him in the starlight, he had seen something in her eyes that was not the frenzy of fear, had felt something about her yielding hands, had sensed something about her that arrested him. But he did not take it very seriously. He was more concerned just then with finding Asia. He passed two men returning from the dell and heard that, as far as they knew, no one had been to Mrs. Brayton. To be sure, he searched the place thoroughly himself. He was afraid the child had fallen asleep somewhere, and the nights were still much too cold and damp for that to happen without dangerous results. When he had gone over every bit of the dell on foot, he led his horse through the barred gate in the beach fence that divided the boss's property from that of Mrs. Brayton, and then rode at a fast canter up the hill to the pines. The front door opened as he ran along the shelled path. "She's here," called the old lady, guessing the errand of the midnight runner. "Thank God. I'll go back. Oh, David, wait a minute. I've just sent Harold as soon as he got back from his meeting. He went 10 minutes ago." Mrs. Brayton lowered her voice as he came up to her. "And you had better take her with you, hadn't you? She wouldn't go with Harold." Bruce looked into the eyes of the old lady, who was still half dressed. She did not realize what a quaint picture she made. "Poor child. Is she very upset?" "Oh, she's been heartbroken. I've never seen anything more pitiful in my life. She hasn't the faintest idea why she was beaten, and she says she won't go home. David, what is the matter with her mother? More than one thing, I should say, and I suspect another child. She was a wreck herself. Oh, dear. And Harold says he heard Roland was out riding with Mrs. Lyman this afternoon." Quite likely. David, you don't seem disturbed. Do you expect people to go on like that?" He smiled at her. "It's not a matter of expecting. I've noticed that they do. Now, where's Asia?" He followed her into her kitchen, where the child sat worn out, with her head upon her hand on the table, the remains of a chicken sandwich and a glass of hot milk beside her. She roused herself as they came in, and when she saw Bruce, she jerked herself up defiantly. "I won't go home," she said fiercely. Bruce drew a chair beside her and put his arm round her. "Would you be glad to know that your mother is dead?" he asked gravely. She drew away from him, stiffening, while every drop of colour faded from her face. "My mother dead? My mother?" She choked, her hate suddenly gone, her lips quivering. With a swift gesture he threw both arms around her and put his face into her hair as if she had been his own child. "No," he said quickly. "She is not dead, but she has been very ill today, and she was worried about you, and she really did not know what she was doing when she beat you. You will all have to be very good to her for a while, and you must not do anything without telling her. She won't beat you again, don't be afraid of that, and you must forgive her, for she is very sorry." She raised her face, her eyes now shining. Her tangled hair fell about her grimy cheeks and tired shoulders. "Poor mother. I didn't know she was ill again, or I would not have run away. I will go home." Mechanically she straightened her torn and tumbled brown wincey dress. Then she looked up at him again and impulsively threw her arms about his neck and clung to him. "Come on," he said after a minute. "We must get back as fast as we can. She is waiting for you." Mrs. Brayton walked out to the pines with them. "Tell your mother I will come to see her very soon. And take very good care of her, my dear," as she kissed the child. "Yes, I will tell her," answered Asia gratefully. Bruce hoisted her up on the front of the saddle, jumped up himself, and with one arm round her started off. She was too tired to enjoy the ride, which at any other time would have been a great pleasure. Before they had gone far she was sound asleep. As soon as he got within speaking distance of Alice, who was waiting at the front gate, Bruce told her all was well. Then he dismounted and lifted Asia down into her arms. As he did so, he saw that perhaps at last she was prepared to take down her barricades as far as he was concerned. She said not a word, nor did he as he turned away to lead his horse back to the kitchen. But he had only gone a few yards along the path when he heard steps behind him. Alice stood alone, Asia having tumbled sound asleep onto the front steps. He saw that she had rushed after him on a sudden impulse, and that she didn't know what to say as she stood trembling. He had no theory to account for the state of emotion he saw she was in, but he felt extraordinarily near to her as she stood there, and he knew that she needed him very badly. Quite deliberately he held out his hand and took one of hers that was holding her cape together. Just as he was about to speak her reserve gave way. "Oh, forgive me," she choked. "I do," he said simply, not pretending that there was nothing to forgive. I "That's enough," he smiled, interrupting her. "You don't have to say it twice or vary it. I am acquainted with the synonyms. I know all you want to say. I do not understand why you have been afraid of me, or why you have misunderstood me, but all you owe me now is a fresh beginning. And don't talk about it, just begin. I think I can help you, and we'll talk about it some day, but not tonight. You have had a bad day, and you get to sleep just as soon as you can. Tell me," he was still holding her hand, and she was staring into his face, "did any one of you give a signal that Asia was found?" She was startled by this transition. "No, at least Mr. Brayton, yes. I think he told someone." "Did anyone blow a horn or anything?" "Oh, yes, a whistle." "Are they all back?" "I don't think so. My husband isn't." "All right. Now please go in and forget everything unpleasant. You know you can." He knew she couldn't, but he knew this would make her try to. He did not know that she wanted to throw her arms round him, but as she turned quickly away he felt as if he had rescued a child from the dark. He continued his way along the path to the kitchen till he heard voices on the spit. Then he turned suddenly, as if he had remembered something, and led his horse down to the store where he met the boss. Roland was hot and irritable. "Where the devil was she?" he demanded. Bruce guessed Alice had not told him the whole story, so he took chances on what he might say. She was at Mrs. Brayton's. She'd gone to sleep in the afternoon, woke up in the dark, and lost her way. "Holy Moses, what a fuss about nothing," he exclaimed, taking up a lantern put down by one of the men who had walked on. "Well, it looked bad," said Bruce rather indifferently. "By the way, as your wife was very badly unnerved, I gave her a sleeping powder. She ought not to be disturbed till she is thoroughly rested." Roland shot a quick look at him, wondering if he meant anything by this, but he could make nothing of that non-committal face on which the weak lantern light cast shadows that brought out the lines. He noticed instead that his foreman drooped as if he were very tired. He knew where Bruce had been all day. He could not help wondering if Bruce knew where he had been. At first he told himself he did not care a damn if he did. Then he hoped he didn't. "Is there a spare bunk in the kitchen?" he asked abruptly. "Several, but take my shanty for the night." Bruce answered as if there was nothing unusual in the boss's question. No, thanks. I'll go to the kitchen." They turned together along the path. "Your wife's going to have another child." Bruce still used his weary voice. "What? Damnation!" blurted out his boss. "Well, they have the habit of coming," drawled Bruce. Roland laughed uneasily. "I suppose they have," he grunted, kicking at a tuft of grass in the path. They walked on some yards in silence. "Walker told me today," said Bruce in the same level tones, "that boy of his, who's had some engineering, would be glad to have a job with you. He might be worth trying." Roland was instantly diverted. "That's so. All right. I'll try him." And business details occupied them till they separated. End of chapter 9.